How's it going, everybody? Welcome to well, I guess it's a live stream. I'm always not sure whether to sort of have a specific introduction or just sort of be like, yes, let's go. But I wanted to do a quick sort of reactionary stream to what happened yesterday. I mean, of course, over the weekend, although those of you who watch the channel more regularly will know that there was a fair amount of coverage of it from me when I was in Albania. Now I'm coming to you from Greece, which I'm sorry that the Acropolis is not in the background, but maybe we'll try and figure that out. But yeah, talking about Washington, D.C. whilst in Greece, the home of original democracy, right? So Western democracy. And yesterday particularly, I think, was an illustration of, well, Trump can take the initiative. I think that's one of the key things. Whether or not you like him as a person, he is quite good at getting things together. Whether or not it actually produces anything of substance is one thing, but things are happening in a way that they didn't, at least for a large proportion of the Biden administration. And don't get me wrong, this is not suddenly some defense of the Trump administration, but the fact that he has had talks with both people in the vicinity of 48 hours is quite impressive. As I said in another video, it reminds me very much of the conversations and efforts he had with Kim Jong-un of North Korea and the South Korea, when he brought them together and they shook hands, and it was all considered a historic moment. And then they met again, I believe, in Singapore, and well, nothing came of it. We still had a hell of a load of missiles being developed and Korea Peninsula tensions. And well, now we're at square one with North Korea supporting Russia in the worst war since 1945 in Europe. So didn't actually achieve much for Trump, but it was quite at the time sort of, some people, again, cautiously optimistic. Ooh, could this potentially lead to something? Now, the situation between Ukraine and Russia, Zelensky and Putin, Europe and Russia, whatever dynamic you want to consider, is much more complicated, comprehensive, and obviously world-changing. But there were a few key takeaways that I thought I wanted to sort of cover. And if you guys have thoughts, then drop them in the comments. But not necessarily talking impresses me, just that you have to begin somewhere. And, the defense of Trump is that sort of at least he's trying to do something, which, I mean, I kind of see that argument. But as I keep saying in other videos as well, it's all well and good to start talks if they're not actually going to produce anything, which most of the time they won't. But that was one of the key takeaways, right? Key takeaway number one is that there is this sort of suggestion that a trilateral summit would be possible. Germany and France, Macron and Merz were very specific in that they sort of thought a trilateral summit would be useful, but equally that it would be unrealistic to expect a full-scale peace deal, which is obviously absurd. But since then, Putin has basically been saying through his labradoodle Lavrov that, we will send us sort of a higher level delegation, but there's no commitment still, unsurprisingly, that Putin will be willing to meet Zelensky. And I think most of you would agree that's because he just doesn't think of Zelensky as his equal. He sees Zelensky, and by extension, obviously, Ukraine is below him. And that's why whenever he makes these communiques, these efforts, it's always directly to the United States. He doesn't even address the Europeans. I think he's done it maybe a couple of times with the French or the Germans, but he's never going to legitimately meet Zelensky and sort of speak to him on a one-to-one in a way that you would imagine. And obviously, Zelensky has made it clear that he's up for that. I think that's a position he's shifted in the past 6 months, and he has to, whether again you like it or not, he has to play the game. And that's why he had to wear that suit. Now, I know some of you probably thought it was absolutely outrageous that he has to answer questions about his suit and the status of that, considering what's actually happening in Ukraine. But it's not just international relations or media, it's Trump's media. And they're obviously going to play to that. But to be honest, I don't think Zelensky could have played it any better his incredibly quick-witted, like it was quite a British sense of humor what he said there about the suit. It was very good, and I could see how his previous life as a comedian, as a someone, in theatrics, came out very well there. And to be honest, it was fascinating watching Trump, because Trump is obviously quite a sort of caged person, but he was caught off guard by that pretty quick witticism by Zelensky. And I thought it was quite revealing, actually, that given enough time, I think Zelensky could win Trump round even more. Again, that's just pleasantries in front of the cameras, but it was quite interesting, I think. I'm not a body language expert or something like that, but I think the psychology of them was quite revealing at that specific moment. And I think it bodes about as well as it could have done given the circumstances. As I said, the other main takeaway afterwards was the pushback by the Europeans. This is like the second main takeaway I noticed. Probably you did as well, but it was like the French and the Germans very specifically saying, don't get, still consider a ceasefire, right? Still at least try to consider a ceasefire. And whether or not that has an effect remains to be seen. But I think it was good that they continue to emphasize that. But what I also thought was really bizarre was this, like, okay, your turn, let's go around the table. It's like a show and tell, sort of, if you ever had those in school, where you're like, okay, Timmy, it's your turn to speak now. What have you got to show us? And it's like every leader had to go around to give their 2 minutes of one, thanking Trump, his praise, what's the word, self-legitimizing him, giving him, sort of a sense of massaging his ego. That's the word I'm looking for, right? But also sort of having to sort of re-emphasize that they're all about peace, that they want to see an end to the war, so as to ensure that it doesn't come off as though they're warmongers or something, whilst at the same time also having to sort of make sure that it's clear, though, that they aren't going to just give in to sort of a peace deal very quickly. So it was really bizarre, to be honest, to see this highly publicized sort of leaders. And there was a photo on X I've retweeted it, of the leaders like sitting in chairs. I don't know if it's AI. I don't think it is. There are a proportionate number of legs on the chairs and the people sitting, but it's literally like, it's like they've been called into the headmaster's office, Trump in his massive chair at the desk, and then all of these heads of state of seriously important countries just sort of huddled around the desk in the White House, and Ronald Reagan looking on the wall in the corner. It's a crazy sort of illustration of sort of the power tripping and the dynamics that Trump wields right now. And just imagine how different this would have been with Biden, right? It would have been a table. They would have all been sitting around probably together on equal terms. But yeah, it's sort of like there's an old illustration in sort of like motivation of like the difference between a leader and a boss. A leader, comes with and inspires his followers, whilst a boss dictates. And it's very much that case with Trump, I think. Again, it's not a sort of defense of everything Biden did, but yeah, very much a piece of showmanship, I think. The third main takeaway is obviously these security guarantees. Now, this is where it gets a little bit of speculative, but in my mind, it's pretty clear that the US would not probably put boots on the ground if we start with like a maximum scenario where they're putting soldiers in Ukraine. I don't think that would be the case. I think it would be more that they would have Europe as the first line of defense. I think they've even quoted as saying that, but that they would have some sort of support. So they would maybe provide more of the logistical side, more specific defense equipment, munitions, that sort of thing. But it is certainly the most decisive that Trump has ever been on any form of security guarantees. But at the same time, he's also saying that he doesn't see, I think it's what he said, paraphrasing, he doesn't see NATO with Ukraine in it, which, to be honest with you, I do find that incredibly unrealistic, just also because of the pragmatic steps needed to integrate Ukraine into NATO. It's taken Bosnia 20 plus years to try to reach the requirements needed, and the membership integration plan, I think it's called, the membership action plan is, or MAP as it's known, is incredibly comprehensive. It's basically all the steps a country has to go through to actually join NATO, right? Through modernization of the military, interoperability, various other details, which if a country that's small and relatively simpler in terms of its security situation relative to Ukraine, of course, Bosnia has Republic of Srpska and other territorial issues. But the point is that if it takes that long for Bosnia to get anywhere near potentially joining NATO, it's going to be very, very complicated for Ukraine. And I think that's why, despite whoever it is, from George Bush, Obama, Biden and Trump, even if they've said, yes, Ukraine will be in NATO, it's always been more in a principle sense than in an actual, we're going to do that right now, tonight sort of sense. So whilst Trump is quite clearly shifting on these ideas of security guarantees, I don't see it going all the way to NATO. And I think that there is this potential that, as I said, they provide more of the logistical, technological aspect, but the Europeans are more on the actual of the military presence in terms of a peacekeeping sense. Again, is that something that Putin's going to agree to? I think he's made sort of shifting comments about it, but I don't have any trust of what he says, obviously. Now, the other thing is obviously more that this is transactional. So Trump wants there to be more of a actual trading or deal between the US and Ukraine. I think there's one that would involve about 67 billion pounds or $90 billion. So that would be something that sort of Trump then doesn't just think it's sunk costs, it's just empty money being given. So that is, again, early stages, but I think quite clearly there is going to be a shift in that regard. Whether or not that means a legitimate change in the borders of Ukraine, or that you can guarantee that Russia won't try this again, it's too far off, but it's the minimum that the Europeans and Ukraine itself have been pushing for, and that's quite a big step. Whether or not, again, Putin does something to undermine that, or Trump has a change of heart, he has the mental bandwidth of a toddler, bipolar disorder, clearly, the amount of times he pivots, taco. Yeah, that's sort of what I'm thinking. But again, and then the last thing I just really wanted to underline is how much of a difference the Oval Office experience was. I'm very curious what you guys think about that, but I do think that there's a lack of emphasis or consideration of psychology and the individual relations of leaders, because in terms of autocrats, strongmen, it's incredibly important, right? The relationship of President Xi to Putin is incredibly important in terms of how the Sino-Russo relationship works out. The nations' relations are different to the personal relations of those two. Putin and Xi are very close, but Russia and China do have their own geopolitical tensions. Think of the Arctic, think of Manchuria in the East. And so if you had a slightly less decent relationship between those two, it might not be as close as it is, at least how they claim it to be. I don't know, even India, I've got a video coming out later this week about China and India relations. You know, the relationship of Modi to Xi is quite important. The relationship of Modi to Trump, right? Trump is making a lot of impacts on Indian economics with his tariffs, and the only reason it's not even worse is because Modi still has some degree of respect. Modi was the second or third leader, I believe, after Netanyahu to visit the White House in February, which is very important because it shows you a priority of the new head of state to whichever country. And, you know, Modi came before the UK. So the point I'm making with this is that Zelensky's efforts to stay on the good side of Trump are very important. And he really is trying to, I mean, the fact that he handed this letter from his wife to Melania Trump is I think that's pretty powerful stuff. A very good bit of diplomatic statecraft from Zelensky, and yeah, it's a good step forward. I think, again, I'm not getting too carried away in that this is going to be the be all end all, but there's definitely positive things to come from this, right? And if anything, considering that we thought at one point the US would completely just ditch Ukraine and it's a free-for-all, and the Europeans would have to quickly pick up that slack. This is very reassuring. And again, I want to temper expectations by saying I don't think some of the US are going to go to the whole hog that Biden's administration might have done, for example, but it's definitely a positive direction. But ultimately also, I'm sort of contradicting myself or counter-arguing myself again, is regardless of any of this, even if there is, let's say this is the best case scenario and Trump commits to, unrestricted support, I still must maintain the Europeans have to prepare for the worst, right? As if some of you saw my short, I posted a short yesterday very quickly, but the emphasis of that is plan for the worst, but hope for the best statement, right? Europe has to do that. It's not just about Ukraine and on it unilaterally. It's about Europe as a whole, and Europe can no longer be dependent on the US, regardless of whether Trump's in a good mood and decides to be more generous. It doesn't matter. Europe has to step up even more. And whilst things are happening, I don't want there to be a sense of complacency amongst European capitals. I don't think there is. I mean, it was very interesting to see that the Finland's leader, Alexander Stubb, I believe, if I'm saying his name right, he was there. And, you don't think of Finland in the same, no offense, economic or diplomatic power as the Germans or the French, but he was there. And it shows you that it was a very good, I think, strategic thinking from the European delegation and group to have the country with the single longest border and extremely complicated, delicate history with the Russians there as well. And also because Alexander is a fantastic statesman. He knows how to engage Trump. When he was out of office, he was doing some podcasts, I think, or he made some comments, he made some appearances, and he discussed how he deals or tries to engage Trump. And it is very effective, I think. Not being too charm offensive, like not just trying to suck up to him so much, but, delicately trying to frame things in a way that he's like, well, but think about it like this, Mr. Trump, Mr. President. So I think it was very smart to have him there. And obviously, Giorgia Meloni, she's always slightly different. She supports Ukraine, but she's obviously got a slightly more nationalistic vibe to some of the others. I think it was positive in that regard, but we'll have to see what the Kremlin does, which, well, I don't know. Cautiously optimistic, DeVos, I do. Cautiously optimistic. Again, I'm not, what's the word, naive in the sense of, oh, it's all fine. No, I'm very cognizant of what we're dealing with here and who we're dealing with. But I do think it could be a lot worse, right? Like if we cover the Alaska summit for a second, that could have gone a lot worse. It could have been a case, and I genuinely was worried about that. I was generally concerned that there was going to be a backdoor deal sort of thing. Trump would just be fed up with the whole thing. I want a deal. I don't give a shit about what happens to Ukraine. I don't care about, the details of territorial stuff that, well, is thousands of miles away and doesn't affect my interests in America and great power politics, etc. And they just sidelined Ukraine and carve it up sort of thing. But they didn't. And I think that's a positive step. And I think what happens now in the case of Europe and America is very dependent on how overzealous, greedy, potentially Putin becomes. Because if he continues to strike Ukraine, which funnily enough, he has been in the past, 24 hours again, Trump's just going to be like, well, he's an idiot or whatever. He's not exactly the most intelligent person in the world, but even he will return to what he was saying in June, right? Stop it, Mr. Putin, killing all the indiscriminate bombings. It's enough. He'll just realize. And I think it could be a point where just Putin oversteps. The overreach of the Kremlin is actually the biggest blunder here, because, Putin, master strategist, as we know, he's fantastic with his whole 3-day SMO. I don't agree that it only hurts Ukraine, to be honest with you, but, we'll have to see about that. Now, I'm just reading through some of your comments. The other interesting thing I was reading about was the actual cost of this. So obviously Trump has said absurd figures, 300 billion, I think he quoted. It's actually about 130. The Europeans, I think, is about 150, 160 at this point. How is Trump going to frame that? And how is he going to justify that to his domestic audience? Because his poll ratings are not great. And Americans are beginning to feel, I think, a little bit of the, self-destructive impact of the tariffs, let's be honest. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see just how far he can go with this, how he tries to frame this in a domestic angle. And I think it's going to be tough for him. That's my other problem, which is that if his domestic situation, or even more broadly, just the US economy, which is looking, it's not terrible, but it's looking delicate, I guess. If that continues to degrade, then that is going to be a problem for Trump. And he may well then decide to change his foreign policy objectives, right? So if he thinks that there's a problem over domestic confidence in the economy, then he may well think, well, I can't afford to support Ukraine. And so he might actually then revisit his support. So there is that potential angle, that there is a reduction in support of Ukraine, not because of something that happens in the war or because of Zelensky or something, but because of Trump's own domestic pressures. So I wouldn't say we're at square one again. I definitely think we're further than square one, to be honest. I think we're a bit, because if we're at square one, then Trump would be not entertaining security guarantees. He wouldn't be talking about these things. I think the problem is whether or not he can be swayed on a ceasefire. If he can't be swayed on a ceasefire, then we are maybe not at square one, but we're certainly in English, we say sticky wicket. We're sort of like, where do we go from here sort of thing. So yeah, Putin does he need his skin to be saved? Well, if you look at the state of the Russian economy, it's not perfect. That's I think for certain. So we'll have to see. But I think it was all in all a pretty productive session, and it could have been a lot worse. It could have been a lot better. You know, some people are going to say one of both sides, but you know, we've got these continued conversations now happening of this coalition of the willing. I wish there was a more definitive term given to things. Sometimes it is quite frustrating. But you know, remember when the UK and the French, I think they led it. They've been really pushing the ball on this, and with the Germans now on side with a much more proactive Merz, I think I need to do a deeper dive into Germany's shifts in its economy and military production, because a lot is happening out there. I think there is a lot more than just at square one. The Europeans are much more proactive on this. The problem is you've got still obviously countries that can be obstacles, namely the Hungarians. In the aftermath of the Alaska meeting, Putin was in conversation with both Turkey and Hungary, which I thought was quite interesting, that it was those two countries that he spoke to first, especially obviously Turkey, given its balancing act, hedging in both the Caucasus. If you haven't seen my video on Armenia and Azerbaijan, I recommend you to go and see that, because that's sort of a win for Trump, and he wants to try and emulate that in Ukraine, but also because of what's been happening in Syria and the Trump administration's views of Syria. So Turkey has been balancing sort of engaging with the Russians, but also sort of playing on the good side of Trump. And then there is obviously the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico. He wrote, I think earlier today, I saw in a post that NATO membership is not going to happen. It will be, what did he say? Let me find it. Today, the fact that Ukraine will not be in NATO is already taken for granted. So, I mean, whether or not we want to pay attention to what the Slovakian leader has to say, no offense, Slovaks, like, it's quite clear that there would also be troubles in that. So, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot here. This is the problem with diplomacy. There's a lot of drama around it. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of glitz. But then once you get beyond that, it's slow again. It can be very slow. And what I would say, actually, I've written some notes down here as well. Let me just go through, was the reaction. So we've had various leaders speaking afterwards. So the Estonian Prime Minister has already said would be willing to contribute boots on the ground. So you would basically have a multinational force that would probably be there, in a defensive posture. Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, said that leaders of Canada, Japan, Turkey, New Zealand, and some of the smaller EU states had been assessing the outcomes of this meeting, and that realistically they would probably have to do something in that, more proactive sense. I think the biggest dilemma here, if we just get specific for a second about the scenarios for Ukraine itself, is you're going to see a lot of pushback by the Kremlin about troops in the country, but I don't think Putin will have much of a ability to reject Trump's pressure to have some kind of peace. If they were very deliberately labeled as peacekeepers, obviously pro-Putinists will claim that this is, the proxy war elevating to a new level, and that NATO is even more at war than it has been with Russia. Those kinds of narratives. But if you do have a multi-national force, a bit like you get in peacekeeping entities in the Sahel. So there was I think the French led it, but you also had Americans there, you had British, you had European sort of task force. So if you had these kinds of groups in Ukraine, it would be a good deterrent, and I think a good optical sort of symbolic support for Ukraine. But whether or not that makes a difference in terms of the line of contact, where the war is actually being fought, whether or not the war was still being fought, or the lines were frozen, or this ceasefire happened, is different, right? You can still have troops in the country acting as a sort of logistical and defensive unit, but the war doesn't stop. I think there's a misconception amongst certain commentators that they're mutually exclusive, that just because you get the troops, you get the ceasefire, which is not necessarily a guarantee. Or you get the ceasefire and then Putin violates it. So, and the other thing is, obviously, if you get a freeze in the conflict, where is that? Along the current lines? Or is Trump going to pressure Zelensky to give up Donetsk, Luhansk, the territories that Russia more or less controls completely, in exchange for sort of Russia withdrawing from Zaporizhia and Kherson, because Putin controls about 60-70% of those respectively. So there are lots, or he says, if you give up Crimea, Russia, you have to pull out of all of mainland Ukraine. Like, these are the different scenarios, subtle scenarios that could happen. And based on Trump's additional comments today around the unlikelihood of NATO accepting Ukraine, but also about regaining Crimea, I think we're beginning to see an idea of where Trump would prefer to take this. Again, there's no guarantee of any of this. Ukraine can reject it. Zelensky may well just reject it, but then that's a huge risk because of what it does to his relationship with Trump. And that could risk the security guarantees, which then risks the whole of Ukraine more broadly. So is it a case of you have to accept a loss for the greater good? I know this is not a comfortable thing to see, but it's not an easy thing. I don't think, well, that's the point, let down. What deal? There are many different subtleties, right? It depends on what the Europeans can create in terms of security assurances. It's what Trump is willing to support. It's whether or not there is a flexibility on Zelensky's part. What do Ukrainians themselves see as a realistic scenario? Are they willing to let go of Crimea if it means that they maybe get back all of the mainland? Or are they willing to see Donetsk, occupied indefinitely by Russia, if it means that more of the country westwards is the Russians pull out or the Americans force them to pull out? This is part of the problem, is that we don't know what kind of angle a deal could look like, or what kind of angle it's framing towards. So and also this whole emphasis of Putin wants the languages like Russian to be, what's the word, embedded, I can't remember the right word, but, ingrained in the constitution, protected, the Orthodox Church to be protected, which Trump may or may not be kind of indifferent to, but it's one of Putin's maximalist demands. And if Putin doesn't think that Trump's doing that, then he's not going to go ahead with the deal, is he? So, and ultimately, any ceasefire does benefit both sides, but one more than the other. And in this case, it could probably benefit the Russians more. And if they militarize again, and then they seek to try to, retake even more territories under claims of X, Y, and Z, i.e. false flags, then we're back. Then we are actually back at square one. So I think Trump is keen to try to find a way to effectively deter Putin enough, but also get this done relatively quickly. So, longer term, could I see a scenario where Ukraine retakes back everything? Quite possibly. The Europeans are really developing their military capacity again. Ukraine's in-house drone development and other things is incredibly impressive. And give it, by the end of the 2020s, right? Let's say in 5 years, could they potentially try to retake all of it? Yes. But I think in the short term, they may have to accept some concessions for the longer term sort of building up of reserves and capacity to then actually properly retake it all and the country to be restored to what it was in 1991. But that's a longer term thing. So we shall have to see. But any other comments, thoughts about this, do drop them in the comments. I did also want to go through some key points that Trump made during a Fox interview. So he is trying to arrange this trilateral meeting. What's interesting is, though, that it wouldn't involve him. The first one would be between Putin and Zelensky. And then if that works out, then he would go to it trilaterally and, quote, close it up. I love his sort of just shameless, like, yeah, I'll just show up and it'll be a done deal. It's like he's dealing with real estate, isn't it? Oh, it's so good. And he said he hopes Zelensky would show some flexibility, which again, as I said, Zelensky may have to sort of play the game, except that in the short term, Ukraine has to take some losses, so to speak, or some concessions. But in the longer term, because ultimately then it puts them in a better place to regain all of what is originally of the country in the longer term. Let's say we get a more favorable Democrat in the next US election in 28, then maybe then sort of Ukraine is buoyed enough, confident enough, capable enough at that point to do so. Trump's very clear there will be no troops on the ground, which I think is kind of obvious. And yeah, he said that very bluntly that any efforts to return to Crimea or for Ukraine to join NATO's membership completely are, what did he say exactly? Both of those are, quote, impossible. So yeah, that's why as I said, I'm trying to be cautiously optimistic, but also pragmatic in what Ukraine, Zelensky have to work with here. And it might not be what everyone wants to hear, at least in the short term, but it's more likely what could happen. I had a really interesting conversation once about sort of like trying to understand how I look at the world. And it's sort of, if you've ever heard of, what's it called, pragmatic idealism. It was something that the former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, if that's what position she held, but she was basically saying that sort of, she's practical, but also with an idealistic look on the world, right? Idealistic look on the world's events. And I take sort of some detail from that. I'm more of what's known as a strategic idealist, in the sense of like, I think longer term, I would like nothing more than to see Ukraine back to its fully restored borders. But in the shorter term, that might be unrealistic to achieve, especially when we have conditions like this, where Trump is saying this, Putin's behaving like that, the Europeans are sort of in this state of flux. But I think, again, in the next few years, when things begin to consolidate, right? Compound. The Europeans everything begins to develop. We've got more in-house development. The Ukrainians are more in-house developers of various advanced tech. When the deals with the US and Ukraine perhaps begin to show results, then the power dynamics change, and much more in the favor of the Ukrainians. In the short term, though, it might not be that case. So that's sort of how I try to think about it, right? Not just in what happens every day with the strikes, but in the longer term, and not just longer term in terms of two or 3 years, but 5, 10 years. The biggest consideration of all of that is obviously the demography. A couple of you have already put it in the comments. Ukraine does have a manpower shortage, and obviously just the beyond terrible effects this has on the population, on the country's demographics, and the young men who are losing their lives for literally, meters of territory. Absolutely horrible. So that is my biggest concern as well, is what this does to Ukraine's demographic and also therefore economic situation going forward, and whether or not its reliance on the Europeans will only grow or what happens then. But that's sort of a bigger picture scenario. The midterms will be a bloodbath, yes. They will be an absolute bloodbath. So yeah, it's going to be nuts. But I think, guys, that's largely what I wanted to say. It was a bit of a hot take. I did a video, as I say, about my thoughts on Alaska, but given that I'm traveling a little bit at the moment, I took much of July to sort of be settled, but August I had FOMO. I wanted to travel a little bit, and obviously running a channel where we try to stay on topics as much as possible is a little bit tricky. But I'm going to be stationary for a bit in the next week, 10 days. Got a couple of fantastic guests. I'm really excited to be interviewing Christopher Miller, who is the Ukraine correspondent, like the main correspondent for the Financial Times. And he's done some incredible work. So if you've got any questions or things you'd like me to hear from me raise with him, then do let me know. And also a couple of more people. I'm also trying to get some regular current YouTubers back on the channel, probably have Jason back on, and also going to be doing something with a new guest, Professor Gerdes, which I'm very excited to do as well. But if you've got any other questions or thoughts, do drop them in the comments. At this stage, it's going to be basically wait to see what the Europeans can come up with, whether or not Trump is satisfied with those terms, whether or not he feels he needs to push Zelensky more. I think what will more realistically happen is that Putin will just not be willing to meet Zelensky. Putin will piss Trump off, and Trump will be like, okay, let's get the ball rolling with this security guarantees, security initiatives. And if anything, it will still come out at least, relative better for Ukraine than Russia. And Putin will be on the receiving end of more sanctions. And Trump even alluded to that as I've been recording. He literally just said, and if Putin doesn't try to be more agreeable, then he will face tough ramifications. I think that's pretty clear. I think Trump he's not exactly a brain box, right? But I do think he's beginning to realize that Putin cannot be taken at face value. And that's going to have a huge, once you piss off Trump, right? Once you get on his bad side, I think he's seeing that Zelensky's a lot more willing to make an effort, right? And again, those jokes, those little moments in the White House Oval Office, they matter because it builds up rapport. It builds up a sense of sort of, I don't know. I could see the way Trump was looking at Zelensky. And whilst he went off and talked about in-mail voting and all that crazy shit, it was quite revealing. I think that Trump's more, yes, he had the chatty stuff with Putin, but again, I think a lot of that was for the cameras. And he's only met Putin once, and he's met Zelensky more times. And the more times you meet someone, the more you are able to build up that personal understanding of each other, even if it's got its tensions. And Trump and Putin have met only once, or well, some of you think it was a double. I don't. But yeah, so we'll have to see. But I think either Putin overplays it badly, and Trump has his own domestic issues, but also the Europeans propose something. We're going to see. But I remain cautiously optimistic, but also, pragmatically realistic about it as well. But that's it, guys. I'll leave it there for today. Thanks a lot. take note, James, share. Thanks a lot, everyone. Do watch the videos if you haven't on Azerbaijan, on Alaska reactions. We've got a couple more videos coming out this week as well, and some deeper dives. I'm working on some more thorough sort of analysis videos, like sort of not necessarily as time sensitive. So Russia's operations in Africa and how bad those have gone for Wagner. So if you're more interested in sort of deeper dive, bigger picture sort of things over a bigger time scale, then keep a lookout for those. They're pretty cool things that I'm working on in the background. But take it easy, everyone, and we'll speak to you soon. Take care.